Thank you for coming to this first event of SURE-AI at STAR Seminars. And I'm told, first of all, that it would be very nice if you could come forward, particularly those that have chosen the back seats down there. Come forward and sit in front. So welcome. Welcome to this occasion, which is a joint venture with the newly established Center of Excellence for Artificial Intelligence, that's called SURE-AI, Sustainable, Risk-Averse, Ethical AI. That's a grand goal we have. And also the thematic research group, Unruly Sustainability at Political Sciences, and that is under the auspices of UIO, Energy and Environment sections. And it's organized by the Stochastic and Risk, that is what STAR stands for, but the section is called Risk and Stochastics. And let me first of all thank David here, Pere and Leonardo, who have been very helpful in putting up this event. But not only them, because this event is also together with the Science Library, where we are right now. And the Science Library has a team of very competent people. We have Lynn, Doug, and Theodore, who are following us in all this day. And also, we have Yu Tong, exactly from the Science Library, who has organized an exhibition of books on the history of artificial intelligence and climate change. Now, this exhibition is right at the entrance, under the screen, and you are very welcome to take the books, just pick them up from up, and read them, borrow them. Some of them are even in electronic format. There is a QR code, so everybody can do it, and they are available there. So that's a feature that we have in addition. But what is the topic today? This is environmental cost of AI. So artificial intelligence has been discussed at length, a lot about efficiency, a lot what AI can do for sustainability, and now we reverse the question and we discuss if it is sustainable itself and what we can do to make it as such. So the program today, it's with two talks, two main speakers, and a panel discussion coming later. In the meanwhile, at your own tempo and ease, you find some refreshment that you can take whenever you wish. This said, I have started talking without introducing myself, but now we come to the scientific part. So I'm Giulia Di Nunno. I'm professor here at the Department of Mathematics, surprise, in Risk and Stochastics. And I'm going to be the host today of this event. The first speaker is Gino Gancia, who is now called to come on stage. And Gino has quite wide, I would say, international experience. After a PhD at Stockholm University, then he at MIT and Cray in Barcelona and Queen Mary University in London, eventually landing at the University of Milano Bicocca, where he is professor right now. So he is an expert in international trade and macroeconomics. But the focus today is about technological change, the effects, the economic integration of these, and a lot more. But today he is going to talk about the cost of AI, mostly related to data centers. So I think the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Giulia, and all the people who worked to put together this great program. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to present joint work with Alessandra Bonfiglioli, Rosario Crinò, and Mattia Filomena. And the goal of this project is to study the effect of AI on CO2 emissions. I think we should start, however, with a disclaimer. As Julia already said, we are not experts on the technical aspects of AI, and we are not even experts on the environment. We are economists. However, we think that we have tools that can be useful to address this question, and this is what we bring to the table. So the idea is to try to study the effect of AI on CO2 emissions. This is, of course, an important and timely question. As we all know, there is much hype about AI. It's considered a transformative technology that has the potential to boost economic growth, to increase productivity. And some people believe that it can also speed up the green transition, for instance, by increasing energy efficiency. However, recently, we have seen also the darker side of AI that has attracted significant attention, and in particular, the fact that AI requires lots of data and computing power. The key infrastructure that supports AI is data centers, and data centers are power hungry. So as of now, as of today, data centers consume already around 4% of the total US electricity. And this number is expected to increase over time, perhaps to 8 or 9% by the end of the decade. So this, of course, raises the question of what is the net effect of AI on emissions. Clearly, there are contrasting effects, and so we think that in the end, this is going to be an empirical question on which, however, we don't have an answer yet. So if you look at the media, you will typically get a sort of bleak picture. So here you see some recent articles published by newspapers. And as you can see from the title, so US power demand surge from data centers could tilt fossil fuel generation, or AI means running US coal plants for longer. And there are several articles like this. However, this is sort of anecdotal evidence. And so what we are going to do in this paper is instead to look for systematic evidence on this and to try to put numbers on these concerns. Okay, so basically what we are going to do is to study the effect of AI on CO2 emissions in the US over the period from 2002 to 2022. And we do this in multiple ways. So first, we start to look at evidence across US commuting zones. We have more than 700 commuting zones, and these commuting zones are basically small regions, local areas. And in looking at the impact of AI on emissions, we try to decompose different effects that have been emphasized in the literature. A scale effect. AI can increase production, and production typically generates emissions, and so through the scale of economic activity, it may impact total emissions. Technique effect. AI may promote more efficient techniques that lowers emissions per unit of output per capita, and through that may potentially lower emissions. And there might be also an industry composition effect. If AI, for instance, increases the relative size of the service sector, the service economy, which are possibly less carbon intensive compared to heavy manufacturing, this may also have an effect, possibly a positive, beneficial effect on aggregate emissions. We look also at specifically at electricity generation because, as we have already discussed a little bit, clearly AI has a direct effect on the demand for energy. Okay, and to shed light on this latter part, to dig deeper, we bring in data from power plants where electricity is generated. And there we are going to study the effect of AI on energy generation, and in particular the different source mix, so renewable versus non-renewable sources at the power plant level. And in doing so, we will also try to look more specifically at the role of data centers, since data centers is really the key infrastructure that is used by AI, and probably it's the one that requires the largest amount of energy, of electricity. Okay, and then since we want to identify causal effects, we don't want to stop at conditional correlations, we will have to address this additional challenge that I will talk more later. But before jumping to a preview of the main results, some important remarks. Key challenge in the literature is how to define and measure AI. And so here for this paper, and given the time period that we focus on, we take a very broad definition of AI, a sort of working definition according to which AI is basically an algorithm applied to big data. And the way we measure this in the data is by looking at complementary occupations, complementary workers. And in particular, you will see workers that work in occupations that have to do with data workers, basically. So this means that, the second point, we're gonna, given the time period that we study, what we're gonna do is basically to look at the recent past in order to try to learn lessons that hopefully are gonna be useful for the future as well. But it's important to understand that given the sample that we use, it's not gonna be able to capture properly the most recent applications of AI. At the same time, we think that this sample period covers a lot of action. So it's basically the digital revolution, internet, digital platforms, cloud computing, and many other, and even generative AI at the very end. So these are the phenomena that we are going to capture and measure in our data. But again, it's important to understand that we are trying to learn something from the past. We are not in the business of making predictions about the future. And if you are interested in that, which I think is a very interesting question, of course, you have to wait for the second presentation, which is really about future scenarios. And then finally, third important remarks, we are going to focus on local effects. It's much easier to identify local effects, which means that we can do it in a more precise, in a better way. But it also means that we are missing part of the story. So for sure, data centers, data workers that work in one location may also be selling services to distant places. We are not going to measure that indirect effect. So this is a caveat that we need to bear in mind. So having said that, here a little preview of the main results of the paper. So first result, we find that AI penetration increases CO2 emissions. And again, this is a differential effect. So it applies to commuting zones, so local areas that are more exposed to AI relative to other areas where there is less of AI penetration. I'm sure that you want to have an idea about numbers, so here we have computed some. And again, since the result is in relative terms, what we identify is a differential effect. So we start from the average commuting zone. And to start with a benchmark, in the average commuting zone, what we know is that emissions have fallen by 25%. And this is something that we observe, and this is the outcome of the green transition over this period. Okay? But then, given our estimates, we can sort of think about an hypothetical commuting zone that is identical to the average one, with the only difference that this commuting zone over this period is supposed to have no exposure to AI. And according to our estimate, in that commuting zone, which is sort of isolated from the AI revolution, then we would observe a decline in emission by 34%. So it's significantly larger in emission. So these numbers suggest that AI adoption may indeed slow down the green transition. However, it's also important to better understand this result, and to do that, we start to dig deeper. And in particular, we want to know what drives this result. And the second important result in the paper is to show that, to a large extent, this result is driven by scale effects. So AI penetration increases total emissions, but if you compute emissions per capita in per capita terms, then you do not find much of an effect, with an important exception that I will mention in a second. And so this suggests that, yes, AI we may have some concern about AI, because basically what is happening is that it's promoting economic activity, and as we know, this economic activity also generates emission. But maybe, it's just a reshuffling of economic activity and therefore of emissions around, rather than an increase in total emissions. However, as I said, there is an important exception, and this has to do with the generation of electricity. So what we find for the generation of electricity is that AI increases emission intensity, so in per capita terms. And this is an important result precisely because in the end we are concerned about the demand for electricity coming from AI. So it's a result that we want to better understand. And so we try to zoom in and to explain what is happening. And so basically what we find is that AI penetration or adoption to AI lead to an increase in the use of non-renewable resources that typically also emit more CO2. And finally, we find that this effect is largely driven by the presence of data centers. Okay, so in the interest of time, I will skip the literature, but let me move to the data that we use. So for CO2 emissions, we use the Vulkan dataset that has emissions at the local level, which is what we need for our analysis, and it's CO2 emissions from basically fuel combustion. It's at the local level, we aggregate it at the commuting zone level, and we have the CO2 emission in total, but also by macro sectors: electricity generation, business, residential, and transportation. Then the second key variable is our measure of AI exposure or AI adoption. And as I mentioned before, we look at complementary skills, and in particular, our measure of AI adoption is going to be the share of employment in data-intensive occupations. So we need to identify what these data-intensive occupations are. And to do that, we use a data set of US occupations. It covers more than 900 occupations. And out of those 900 occupations, we identify 13 that we define as data-intensive. And the criteria for an occupation to be data-intensive is basically that software typically used for machine learning and data analysis should be requested in the typical job ad for such a position. And also that these are occupations that typically require a degree in computer and information sciences. So if you want an example of one of these 13 data-intensive occupations, the most obvious one is data scientist. But of course, there is also a bit more, typically occupations that have to do with data, to some extent also with computer and software. Once we have these data-intensive occupations, we can aggregate employment in those occupations at the commuting zone level that we're going to use, but also at the sector level, so that we can identify also the sectors that are more exposed, in a sense, to AI. Then we bring in data on data centers. We're not aware of any existing data set that can be used. So what we did was basically to scrape the information from global directories. And we identified around 2,200 data centers in the US. For each data centers, we have different information, the exact location that we are going to use to compute distances, the physical size for many. And then we combine these also with the data on power plants where electricity is generated. We have data on more than 13,000 power plants in the US. And we have information about the capacity, again, the geographical location, which is going to be used to compute, again, distances, CO2 emissions, electricity generation, and importantly, for what we are doing, also the different power sources used by the power plants, renewables versus non-renewables. So some descriptive evidence before moving to our statistical analysis. So here you see the trend in CO2 emissions over time, over our sample period, in total, and also decomposed in the 4 main macro sectors. And so here, what you can see, what I anticipated already, you see a decline in emissions over time. And the second important fact from this picture is probably the fact that electric emission, so this darker gray part, are substantial. They are more than a third of total emissions. So many of our results are going to be about emissions from the production of electricity, and this is not a trivial part of the total emissions. It's more than 1/3. Next, some descriptive evidence about AI adoption, emissions, and the location of data centers. So here you see maps of the US. The different areas are the commuting zones that I was mentioning before. And then in the top map, what you can see in different colors is the share of employment in data-intensive occupations in the different areas. And here you see, if you look at the top map, that data workers are basically located where you have the technological hubs, in big cities, university towns. In the bottom picture, you have total CO2 emissions. And again, here you see that they tend to be located also around big cities. And importantly, in both pictures, you also see these red triangles, and these are the location of the data centers. And before starting this project, we didn't really know what to expect about the location of data centers. We read a bit about the technology that they use, their characteristics. We know that they need a lot of power. They also need a lot of water. So perhaps ex ante, we had this impression that we would find many data centers in the middle of nowhere where you have natural resources, empty space. And for whatever reason, this is not really the case. The data centers, as you can see, they come in clusters, relatively few clusters. And those clusters tend to be located where the data workers are, so possibly close to the final consumers. Typically, if you study a bit more the location of data centers, it tends to be just outside big cities. And if you put the two maps together, I think visually it's easy to see that locations with many data workers, they also tend to have higher emissions, and they also tend to host data centers. So this is basically our motivating evidence. This is not the evidence that we're going to use for identification, but it's just a starting point that already seems to point in one direction, that there might be some link between these three variables. Okay, so moving to the empirical strategy. So here, this is the main equation that we're going to estimate in the paper. So the outcome variable, the dependent variable, is going to be the change in emission in a given commuting zone over a window of 5 years. And this change in emission is regressed against on our measure of AI penetration, which is the change in the relative employment of data-intensive occupations. So it's a change regression. However, still, we are concerned, we have a number of concerns. The first one is that different areas, different commuting zones may be on different trends, and we want to take care of that. And that's why we also include commuting zone level fixed effect. So our identification is going to be in deviations from commuting zone specific trends. We also add a state time fixed effect, which is meant to capture basically anything that happens at the state level and that varies over time. And what we have in mind is basically regulations that is typically at the state level and may change over time. And we add also a number of controls, given that here the outcome variable is CO2 emissions. We include many controls that are basically related to weather shocks. So this is the basic specification, but we face an identification problem because we are going to identify correlations. Since we have a number of controls, it's going to be conditional correlations, but we want to move beyond. Ideally, we would like to identify the causal effect of AI on emissions. And you can see the main issue is the fact that AI adoption, so these data workers, is an endogenous variable. And so in itself, it may react to other shocks. It may react to emissions as well. So suppose that the commuting zone invests in a green technology, which is also cheap. It becomes a cheap source of energy. Then data centers and data workers may move to that commuting zone. And this will generate a correlation in the data, but it's not really the effect of AI on emission, it's more the other way around. So to identify the causal effect, we need to isolate exogenous variation in our AI adoption measure. And we're going to do that by using what is called in the literature a shift-share instrument. So basically, this is a variable that identifies sector-level shocks. And here, the sector-level shocks are going to be changes in data workers, so employment in data-intensive occupations, at the sector level in the US, not at the local level. And then, so here we get basically these sectorial shocks. We identify sectors where data workers have grown more than others. So those are the sectors where the AI revolution is basically happening. And then we project those sectoral shocks to the commuting zone by basically taking a weighted average where the weights, the shares, are basically the occupational shares across the different industries. So essentially what this exposure measure capture is, and sorry, I forgot to mention this important point, these sectorial shares that capture basically the industry mix of the different commuting zones is computed back in 1990, so well before basically the digital revolution. So basically with this measure, we capture commuting zones that for historical reasons are specialized in sectors where later on the AI revolution is happening. This measure compared to AI penetration is exogenous because if we go back to the example that I made before, by construction, if there is any shock at the commuting zone level, like investing in a new technology, whatever, this exposure measure is not going to reflect that, is not going to vary because the shares are fixed and because the shift, the sectorial shocks, they are computed not at the local level, but at the US level, at the national level. And so with the help of this variable, we will be able to identify exogenous variation in exposure to AI across the commuting zones. Okay, so finally, 10 minutes for the results, right? Okay, so first set of results. So here we see in this table the effect of AI adoption instrumented by the shift share variable that I mentioned on total emissions and then a decomposition according to the different macro sectors. And here you see a positive and highly significant coefficient, which means that AI penetration increases total emission. And this is true overall, but it's true also in many of the individual sectors. It's definitely true for the production of electricity, but to some extent also business emissions, transportation, and perhaps the only exception is residential. But here the main focus is really on these two variables. Okay, so AI penetration seems to increase total emissions. Now we want to understand why. And the first candidate is the scale effect. Is it because it promotes economic activity, and therefore economic activity then leads to more emissions? And to some extent, the answer is yes. So to show that, we redo basically the regression that we saw before, but now we focus on CO2 emissions per capita. Okay, so we want to see if once we control for changes in the size of economic activity at the commuting zone level, what happens? And indeed, we don't find a correlation, we don't find an effect of AI penetration on CO2 emissions per capita in general. This is the first column. But as I was mentioning, there is an important exception once we break the different types of emissions. And the big exception, which, as I showed you, it's a significant part of the total, is electricity generation. So emissions from electricity generations increases also in per capita terms. So the emission intensity of electricity generation increases with AI adoption. And basically, the next of the paper, the rest of the paper is devoted to try to better understand this effect. So let me move to this table. So in this table, we want to check whether or not the effect is driven by changes in the technique, but more than that, we really want to understand what is driving the effect. So remember, now we have identified an effect from AI adoption to emissions. AI adoptions, in the end, is captured by the relevance of these AI or data workers. So we identify commuting zones that are specialized in sectors where the data workers are becoming more important. And of course, one key question is what is really special about those sectors? Is really the use of data, so something really related to AI, or maybe it's some other sectorial characteristics which instead is really driving the result? And so here in this table, we add a number of additional controls that take care of alternative sectorial characteristics which may drive the results. And so here, basically, what we add is, again, a new set of shift share variables that hold the industrial composition fixed, but now let other sector-level characteristics vary over time, not the number of data workers, other things like emission intensity. Is this specialization in sectors that are becoming more with more emissions over time, or employment? Are these commuting zones specialized in sectors that are attracting workers that are growing over time? Output per capita, so it's a measure of labor productivity. Are these sectors where labor productivity is growing over time, or capital per worker, capital intensity? Okay, so we add these alternative variables that try to focus on different sector-level characteristics to check if are those sector-level characteristics driving the results. And if you focus on the last column, which is the most interesting one because it zooms in on electricity production per capita, which is, we think, the key effect that we have identified, you see that basically adding these alternative variables, it has no impact on the effect of AI penetration, and also these alternative variables, they're not really, they don't have any direct effect on emissions. So again, our measure of AI penetration for sure is not perfect. It may capture other things, but the most obvious candidates we control for them, and they are not. So there seems to be really something special about data in those industries. Many robustness checks that, if you're interested, I can refer you to the paper. So just to say that the effect that we have found so far is robust to many ways of treating the data and try to think about possible threats to identifications. But again, due to time constraint, I will refer you to the paper if you're interested. And instead, now let's zoom in on this result on emission intensity from electricity. We want to understand why AI adoption increases the emission intensity of electricity generation. So to answer that question, now we bring in the data on power plants that contains additional information that we have not used yet. And still, we do the regression at the commuting zone level, but we use the power plant data in order to compute at the commuting zone total electricity generation in per capita terms and the share that comes from non-renewable sources. And so here, the key result that we find is that AI penetration leads to an increase in the share of electricity coming from non-renewable sources. Okay, so we change where the AI workers are. Basically, we change the composition of our power mix towards sources that are more carbon intensive. And next, we want to understand in this what is the role of data centers. And in particular, we want to know if the presence of data centers matter for this result, to what extent it can explain that result. So we ask the question, does proximity of a power plant to data center matter for this result? And so in order to test this hypothesis, we estimate these specifications. So now the outcome variable is going to be at the power plant level. And the key explanatory variable is going to be the average distance from data centers that are located in the same commuting zones or in the contiguous commuting zones. So the average distance relative to nearby data centers. Now, of course, the location of data centers is also endogenous, so we also have an endogeneity problem here, and we need to, again, isolate exogenous variation. And to do that, we build on this result that was already sort of clear graphically from the maps, that data centers tend to locate where the data workers are, so where AI exposure is high. And so here we instrument this distance with this new variable, which is basically a weighted average of the average AI exposure, computed, as I mentioned before, of the contiguous commuting zones, weighted by the distance to the single power plant. So basically, this variable here is going to be high for power plants that are surrounded by commuting zones, that are close to commuting zones where there are many AI workers, and therefore where we expect to see many data centers. And so jumping to the results are here. What we find is that, so here the key variable of interest is distance. However, it's more intuitive to discuss this table in terms of proximity to the data center. So now I will talk about proximity. Since, of course, distance is an inverse measure of proximity, we're going to switch the signs in the regression. And so basically what we find is that proximity to data centers leads to an increase in CO2 emissions at the power plant level, and that this is largely driven by an increase in the share of non-renewable power sources. Finally, and this is basically the last result that I'm going to show today, we go back to our commuting zone level data, and we want to study if the effect of AI on electricity, and in particular emissions from electricity, whether or not is driven by the presence of data centers. And to do that, we redo the same regression that I have discussed before, but we also add an interaction term between our measure of AI penetration, so once again the data workers, now interacted by the total size of data centers located in the commuting zone. So basically, if a commuting zone has no data centers at all, then this would be a 0, and then the only effect of AI on emissions would be the direct effect, which is captured by this coefficient. And if you focus on this first specification, you see that there is very little. In one specification, total emissions, they do not increase at all. In per capita terms, maybe they do, but not that much, while this interaction term is actually positive and highly significant, meaning that the impact of data workers or AI intensity is going to be stronger the more data centers you have in the commuting zones. So the main result that AI exposures leads to higher emissions seems to be driven by the presence of these data centers. Okay, finally, I can conclude. So this is just basically a summary of the main results. Since I'm short of time, I don't need to read it. Let me mention very quickly a few points that maybe are going to be discussed also later, but I want to mention very briefly. So the key limitations of this result. So as I mentioned, we look at the recent past to try to understand something useful about the future, but of course here the key question is whether or not generative AI is going to be different. And our view is that, of course, it might be different in some dimensions, but what we know for sure already of this technology is that it relies a lot on data centers. And the effect of data centers is already in our sample, and we have seen what it is. So yes, generative AI may have perhaps a stronger efficiency and productivity effect, but it will have also to compensate for the effect through data centers that seems to be strong and significant. Then, of course, as I mentioned, so here we identify also local effects. So there might be general equilibrium effects that happens throughout the entire economy at the US level. This is not identified in our exercise, but again, if you think that this overall efficiency effect is there, it should be strong enough to compensate the negative effects that we found. And then another possibility is that something that I didn't mention, I think it's important to mention now, I forgot. Why is it that AI leads to this compositional shift towards more CO2 intensive power sources? Well, we don't have the definite answer because we don't have a clear evidence on the mechanism, but from our reading of the literature, the best candidate is the fact that non-renewable provide more stable and scalable energy. And this is what you need for AI, what you need in data centers that require lots of energy and a stable flow. Is this something temporary that perhaps is capturing some sort of short-run bottleneck? There is this power surge, and of course it's much easier to meet it by burning more fuel rather than building up solar panels. So this hints towards dynamic effects that are potentially very interesting. We might be able to say more in the future with a longer time horizon, the moment that we manage to expand our sample. But of course, it's also a possibility. So finally, the result that we have so far seems to suggest that the AI revolution and the green transition, in order to have both of them simultaneously, we need to intervene and to try to make the power grid less dependent on fossil fuels.
Thank you. Thank you. Now let's open for questions. Yes, you had a question? Maybe? Yeah.
I'll speak without the microphone.
The microphone is coming to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Gino for this nice presentation and also emphasize the fact that this is original research. There is very little empirical research and information on that. So this is really an important contribution. The observation is related to something that you mentioned briefly in some of your slides. That is the fact that even we may think that the location of data centers to some extent may also be an endogenous, the result of a political process that decides to locate these data centers in municipalities, states, locations where there is more need of it, because there is already pre-existing skills, economic activity related to data and so on. So this is, and the specific suggestion of thought about the future would be to exploit better the timing of development of these data centers. Probably these data centers have been building up at different times in the US, so that could lead to a sort of event study, difference in difference approach, where you can exploit these in order to shed more light on these causal effects.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Very short question. We are doing that, yeah, so stay tuned. We will have also the diff in diff. It takes a bit of time because the collecting data on the exact timing of opening of the data center was not trivial, but now we basically have the data, and so we are working on that.
Thank you. Any other question? So I have a question. So at the moment, data centers are following data workers, right? So how come? Can we have data workers following data centers and put them in a clever place? Where would you put them, if you could choose?
I think it's a very good question. I think it's potentially a paper on its own that we might consider writing, because I think it's an important one. So we have these maps. We have maps, I did not present them, also of the power grid. And so with all this information, and perhaps with the help of all the mathematicians in this room, we can clearly come up with an optimal algorithm for the best location of the data centers. And I don't have the answer, but my sense is that it's going to be very different from the map that I showed you. So possibly, yes, there are big mismatch between the equilibrium actual location of the data centers now and where ideally they should be in the future. Where there is a lot of space. In space, someone is suggesting that perhaps we should build them up there because the local emissions is not going to be a problem and there is plenty of solar energy. It seems that the technology for doing that is not available yet, but it might in the future. But for sure, trying to optimize both the power grid and the location of data centers, to me, seems a sort of natural things to think.
Yes. What about data workers? Are there, let's say, rich resource already, or it's somehow scarce, so that you need to follow them tight?
So it's a good question. In the US, it might be that they are abundant enough. In other countries, for sure, they are very scarce. And indeed, we have another paper where we study sources of comparative advantage in AI-intensive industries, and data workers are an important part of the picture. So in the US, of course, so basically what we find is that, yes, you need the data workers, you need high skill, but not broad skill. You need STEMs, and even within STEMs, some specific disciplines are better than others. So for the future, probably we are going to need very specific workers. And then whether or not they are enough or too many, I think it's a very good question. We don't have the answer, also because as we all know, AI is also taking some tasks and some jobs that part, at least, of these workers are doing now. So what might happen in the future is that we will have perhaps these top coders that we will become even more productive with the help of these tools. But perhaps this means that, the sort of entry-level, low-level positions, they will become sort of redundant. So that's something that we don't really know. But for sure, as of now, the data workers seems to be one of the key ingredients, probably the most important ingredient for success in these technologies. And so the US already have many. Other countries, Europe in particular, is certainly lagging behind. So maybe this is also a sort of wake-up call.
Thank you. One question?
Data center, if you look at the percentage of energy that is spent, you have that around 50% more or less is for computation, more or less 50%, but you have like 30%, 35%, I mean, it depends, these are rough numbers, right? But let's say 50% is for computation, around 30% is for water cooling, and then you have some overhead of lighting, you know, security, power distribution losses, and 15%, right? But the water is quite a lot. The water is 35%, something like this. So the proximity to water access, I guess, is also something relevant. Not only the energy, but also the proximity to water resources, right? Because you read some articles and say, no, we're going to put this data center in a arid zone where land cheap land, they say, and but then the access to water is more stressful. You don't have so much access. So where is the role of the access to water in the placement? There's some information about this on the placement of the data centers.
So we have done a bit on trying to understand the sort of location choice of data centers, because again, when we saw the map, we were also a bit surprised and we wanted to understand better. And so we did check also, because, you need energy, but you also need water. This is well known. And these type of local resources, they do not seem to matter that much, and they should. So again, I think probably there is some other incentive that is biasing the location of data centers. Also in these very big clusters that may suggest that since these are technologies that are already advanced, but they are also changing very fast, maybe you want to be close to others, to competitors, to exchange ideas, to see what they're doing. But so what we see in terms of outcome, in terms of equilibrium outcome, is these big clusters. And I can tell you, if you run regressions and trying to find correlates of the location of data centers, typically you need, you want to be close to population. So you want population to be close, but you also want space. And this is why the data centers typically end up just outside the big cities. But for sure, from a sort of more technological perspective, there are other considerations that should be important, but apparently they don't seem to matter so much in the location choice. So again, maybe we should try to re-optimize the location of data centers.
It's a lot to do. Thank you that somebody is doing this, and let's give a clap.
Thank you very much.
And we proceed with our program. We have our next speaker, Shivika Mittal from Cicero, Center of International Climate Research, not far away from here, in fact. Shivika holds a PhD in Integrated Assessment Modeling from the Public System Group at the Indian Institute of Management. And she has a very large experience working with energy systems, modeling, and scenario development. Here we are looking into the future. And she is an active member of SURE-AI Center. And nowadays we are going to talk about what happens, help or hindrance, AI and pathways. So the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. So actually, you must have read a lot of, I should say, newspaper, and also now the previous presenter already mentioned that in the past, it actually increases the emissions. Now, whether that will remain true in the future also, whether we actually intervene to change that direction, whether all the claims of big CEOs in the media that you are seeing or benefits outweigh these emissions and all those kind of a thing, whether that is true or not, that's basically motivation. We started this work. So we try to understand it without any kind of a biases, that whether this AI will help to achieve the climate target or whether that will create a hindrance to achieve the climate target. And that's a basically first motivation of our, let's say, this study. And we have actually started this study 2 years back before we started even working on the proposal of SURE-AI, and that was my motivation to join SURE-AI because I want to understand more and more how these things will move, what we can do it to improve it. So we have already, we have already seen the rapid growth of AI in the last 5 years. And why I am saying that? Because in the past, intergovernmental report on the climate change, when the scenario was designed, at that time, the AI was not a very big thing. So in the different scenarios that you actually, coming from the UN, which is actually talked about in the UN climate negotiation, or they were not thinking about AI problem too much, because in those scenarios, it is little bit implicit, but they're not thinking about how AI will change the whole society, how AI will change different sectors and all those kind of a thing. So that was a big, I should say, gap in the previous report. They were not thinking about it because of less of data, less of uncertainty, how AI will actually accelerate in the future. There were a lot of things, and that was one of the major things that we need to understand to actually give policymakers a good understanding what they need to do and how their targets that they are mentioning in the UN, whether you will be able to achieve, because suddenly you have a new problem of AI that you need to handle, your grid needs to handle along with all other things. And then in the last 2 years, you have seen that AI is now on every single computer. People are using as a chat box, people are using to code, people are using for search engines. The query every single years are actually increasing. So demand is also increasing. And suddenly, and also lots of AI and genetic AI and all those kind of a thing, they are gonna do amazing thing in the future, like autonomous cars, self-driving cars, robots in health diagnostic, and a lot of other things which we are already assigning. So we are assigning a lot of works to AI in the future. Then there will be societal impacts. And we need to understand the societal impacts to understand what will be the human-driven emissions. So we need to understand these two things in basically together. I think so. The previous presenter already used this data from the datacenters.com. So you look at this increase in the data. So now, at least based on this website, the data centers already reach 11,000. And also look at the distribution. One is mostly in North America and then in Asia. And then, as we have already discussed on the lens in the previous presentation, look at where the big data centers are. They are actually located in a very highly populated cities. Whether that's good or not, but if you have a concentration of data centers in the major hubs, that's going to have a significant burden on the city infrastructure in terms of water, in terms of energy, and also in terms of a grid that might increase cost to the consumers. So we can, I think so, maybe a little bit of confidence, they are not thinking about these things when they actually started developing, and that was not in their mind when they were starting thinking about data and all, that this can be a big problem in the future. So you will not find optimization in terms of where the grid is, where the renewables are, where the water is. And when we were discussing with the California policymakers, this is a big issue because, as Baltasar also mentioned, if you don't have water, but you have all the companies, they want data center in their city, but that's not relevant for the city, let's say, policymakers. So they have a big problem, what to do with that kind of a thing. Now, this is the first impact, I think so, our previous presenter also mentioned, and this is discussed on length, but there are other impacts that we also need to look at. And when we are talking about AI, right now we are not only thinking about the big data, we are right now, AI definition, at least in our study, is basically what is the computing thing that is done without human intervention. So that is the one definition that was discussed between the different stakeholders, and that's the one thing that we are talking about. So you can see, and as also there are fewer headlines in the previous presentation, you can see that when we are talking about AI, it's look like something miraculous or magic thing that is selling by the companies that, okay, it's okay to start old coal power plant, which is not efficient. Why we are not? We are actually okay to use all coal power plants, which also one signal that they don't think about environment, they don't think about water when they're talking about AI needs, energy needs. And I think so before, Trump was elected, Google was saying, okay, we will achieve net zero emissions. They have a target, now they're backing down. But you can see Google emission actually climbed 50% in the last 5 years only due to AI energy demand. So if the companies start actually talking about net zero plans and other things, then they also face these kind of a problem. So they also need to think about from their company policies and other policies how they actually reduce their emissions. But there's also one interesting thing, that while electricity demand is increasing, computing efficiency is also improving. And historically, doubling approximately around 2.29 years, and that's according to the Kumi's laws. Now, question is whether it's going to keep on increasing, whether that will offset some of the negative effects of AI. So we have to think about it. So as I mentioned in the last IPCC report, this was not included, but I already see these kind of impact. And IA started collecting this data on the data center, what are their energy need, and they started coming up with different scenarios to understand what will be the electricity need of this data center when they're actually coming up with their scenarios, different net zero scenarios, stated scenarios, these kind of a scenario that a lot of energy companies use it. They started it. So if you look at their high winds and the base, it's actually more than 10,000. Sorry, more than 1,000. Then if you look at where the electricity demand will come, you can clearly see where the data centers are in the US, in the Asia. It's not like in the old kind of a transition that, okay, manufacturing is going where the labor is cheap. It's not happening in the same manner in case of a data. So the demand is basically that have GDP, that have data scientists, that have money. The investment is regionalized. It's not outsourced. So maybe usage might be outsourced, but data center, you can see it actually regionalized because of security issue, because of competition issue. There's a race going on, and there's a lot of things, and you can see there will be a regionalized impact because of that. And this is the basic kind of in the current literature, or when you read the headlines, this is the direct impact that we always see, but not the indirect impact. I will talk about impact later. But you always see, okay, you need AI system need large computing demand. To meet those computing demand, you more or less need data centers, servers, GPUs, and as previous mentioned, these are power-hungry data centers. They need electricity demand. But the question is, from the impact side, what kind of electricity, what is the source, whether that is renewable, whether that is non-renewable, that affects your CO2. Then there's another impact, that is water use off-site. So power plants also use water. So there is you can call it in different manner, different scopes. So this is off-site water use. So you have to take into account not water use only on the cooling side, but on the other side also. The second, with one of the audience member already mentioned, cooling system. Cooling system is another point. That's also use energy, that also use water, and here the water use is very much compared to power plant. And then third is hardware needs. Chips and other things require rare earth minerals that require mining. Mining also require energy. Mining also requires other things. Second part, it's e-waste, how you handle e-waste, water use in server manufacturing and energy manufacturing. These need to be actually accounted. And last point, land requirement. Where you're putting the land, this impact, I don't think so. I have seen come across a lot of papers, but they started talking about where you are putting your land, whether there's ecological impact, where there's other kind of impact. If you keep on increasing data center, there will be trade-off between some different uses of land. The land rent will increase. If you are going for a cheaper rent, then water will be an issue. So land cost and whether that makes sense, who will handle the burden, these are the very major issues that we need to think about in the future when we are talking about AI demand and its impact. Now, I was also thinking about the same thing, why we are seeing these kind of trends, that why environment and why water is not considered. Because the people who are actually running these companies are not thinking about it. They're just assuming that we don't have to think about it because this will save the planet without any evidence. They are saying, yes, the green benefit will outweigh its emissions, but there's a part dependency. What you're going to build right now, if you don't think about it right now, what power plants are sourcing your data center, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to close the power center and also move it to renewables. There's a part dependency here. So we need to think right now what kind of infrastructure we are building to meet this AI demand. Look at this, and this is, I think so, this is again, a little bit, I should say, sad to look at this. There's one former chief saying, we are not going to hit climate goal anyways, so why we have to think about this kind of a thing? So that's another, I should say, sad story kind of a thing. So you can understand why they are not thinking about this emissions, they are not thinking about water, and you can see from these headlines, these things are never considered in their decision making. But we need to make sure that these things are considered, otherwise this can actually create a problems for a lot of society. And to end this, this is a very good, I should say, quote from at least Microsoft CEO. If you don't provide benefits to the society, you will lose this social permission from policymakers, from, let's say, people, that you can use our resources, which is not infinite, there's a finite. If you don't start providing benefits, if you don't change it, if you start creating problem to the society, then they will not get this kind of a social permission. Oh, you can do it. You will be prioritized compared to other needs. Then comes what is the aim and approach of this paper. Basically, we want to understand a comprehensive picture how AI will develop in the future, and try to understand different levers, try to understand different links, and what will be the climate impact of those kind of factors. And also, because anyways, as Julia mentioned, I'm an integrated assessment model. I want to put that in the model also, how I captured this. I need a study like empirical one, because there's a lot of uncertainty is in this field, how to model it, how to capture different impact of AI in different sector, whether there is a positive impact, whether there is a negative impact. So we try to understand this and try to put that in the model. So actually, when we give the policymaker some sort of a decision that you should do this, you should have this policy for intervention, we have a better understanding how this AI actually moving into the society and what kind of impacts we are seeing it. So what we did, as I mentioned, there's a lack of empirical study. So we can't do every single thing. So what we did, we approached experts. We approached a lot of Silicon Valley experts. We approached energy experts. We actually approached a lot of electricity experts, manufacturing experts, try to understand what's their view, what will happen in the future. Try to understand it. So we actually use the IDEA approach, where we send the survey, they individually fill the survey of different parameters. Then we actually come together, discuss these different parameters, and then again fill the survey, same survey, but maybe they got understanding, oh, why the other person is filling this survey in this manner. He might be right or she might be right. I should change my survey results. So then we actually created some sort of a distribution based on to understand that different group have a different ideas, different bias or something, but what is the distribution going on to understand the different scenarios, or even to understand what lever is important to take into account. Second, we actually created, based on this, a scenario framework to understand it. And scenario framework is to understand the uncertainty in this scenario space, which lever will move, in what direction, to what degree. And then we created some illustrative scenario to understand how bad things can go, how good things will go, and what kind of levers we need to move. Then creating these scenario narratives, we have to parameterize these scenarios, so we actually, and try to analyze it. This is the first study in the series. So we use integrated assessment model, which is more on the energy side, is the energy system models. It has 15 regions. It was a partial equilibrium model. And we try to understand, OK, what will be the impact on emissions because of these scenarios, because of different variables and different results that we are getting from the experts. So first thing, I would like to highlight what experts were saying when we were discussing this. So first, I would not go in deep because we have already talked about this direct effect. Yes, energy need will increase, localized stressor. I think so the first speaker already talked about it. There might be few more localized impact that if the grid is congested and there's a high demand from data, energy prices will increase, basic economics, demand is high, supply is limited, then the price will increase. That will have a bad impact on the consumers. Then degree to which in that grid or in that region, they can actually meet renewables. If you are actually putting plant where there's no solar, there's no wind, what's your option? So you have to understand those local things. And then the water use, we have discussed this. But now, indirect effect, we need to understand it, which is very difficult to quantify it. And hopefully in the future, we will find more studies. But right now, the literature is going in both the direction. We are finding some positive things. We are finding some negative things. So we have a lot of good conversation with our expert. So first thing is, as I think so, first speaker also mentioned, there will be a lot of efficiency gain. AI will help us to reduce the efficiency gain in building, how we are cooling, how we are heating our buildings, and that can, based on the real-time data, we can actually optimize those kind of a thing. Same thing for the grid also, how we are planning the grid, how we are planning to use renewables in the grid. And the one part is, which is non-negative, but actually in terms of a fuel efficiency, there's a fuel, fossil fuel extraction. And I think so you must have read the Equinor head, I think so, title or their whatever the newsletter that they've already saved 140 million last year in 2025. So they already started making gains using the AI, and that was their report. But along with that, when there's an efficiency gain, as per the theory, there's a rebound effect also. When you actually save something, you want to use something. So these rebound effects sometimes offset the gains also. The second the other indirect effect is AI use in science, that using the AI, you are able to gains in the mitigation relevant technology, like in new material for batteries and some other technology, new battery material for CCS. There are so many others use that you actually improve the cost, reduce the cost of green techs also. This is very, very difficult to quantify, and we were not able to model it or let's say parameterize it, at least right now. Is AI algorithms is able to help you to target audience. And when you have a target audience, or make sure you actually understand, okay, based on these ads and all those kind of a learning from those kind of a thing, there will be additional demand. So when there's an additional demand of XYZ product, there will be energy consumed to produce those products. So yes, GDP will increase. When GDP will increase, that means you require more production of consumer goods, whether what kind of a demand will increase. Right now, we don't have that. Using these AI algorithms, what is the impact on the consumer consumption? So this kind of impact is still not like relationship between AI and the consumer demand is still not very clear. There are a lot of estimates going on, but it's not very clear what is the exactly relationship and how that relationship will change in the future when it's become more and more advanced. Then comes AI algorithms and polarization. This is a very big thing, I think so. There's so many social scientists already talking about it, that because of AI, they're already creating polarization in the media and the society. When this becomes a big thing, then the social acceptance of the climate policy is becoming a very, very big task for the policymakers. That any policies that you want to implement that can help in climate policies, the social acceptance of those policies are going down because of these kind of a polarization. We have already seen it. Trump is basically I think so, not allowing 3 or 4 wind farm plants in the US. So these kind of thing, and there will be a backlash in that manner. Fifth point is labor market, whether that will increase the productivity gain, whether there will be unemployment. If there's unemployment, then there might be a social unrest, and then it will be hard for policymakers to govern it. It reduces the capacity for them to implement climate policy. But there's a positive side also. So AI can also help them to monitor and actually comply with the companies and different policies also. Let's say I give you an example, they can understand, okay, what is the rate of deforestation, what is the methane emissions, whether the countries are making whatever they are promising in the UN negotiation, whether they're meeting the targets or not. Is it easy to monitor? Like we have already seen these kind of a digital infrastructure and other things in CBAM. So these kind of a thing will help to make companies comply also when they have this AI tools. So that can also be in the positive direction, not in the negative direction. So not everything is gloomy, but my point is we need to make sure what kind of intervention we are doing it. So what happened that not everything we can model. So we have categorized these uncertainty in the 3 categories. One is sectoral efficiency gain, AI and science, and implementing climate policies, and also the energy use, which is obviously very simple in the model if it's an energy system model. So these are some examples from the experts' illustration. So if you look at what expert is saying compared to IA, this is very much interesting. So for 2030, they're actually saying lower than IA headwind scenario. They are saying the demand is going to be lower. It's like 527 terawatt hour, IA demand is higher. But in 2040 and also in the high, it's actually higher than IA high scenario compared to IA's, it's around 10.3% of 2024 electricity demand. So it's actually higher in 2040 compared to IA numbers. So there's a difference between how high you can get it if you scale up, but in 2030, if you want conservative estimates, they are actually lower. So there's some agreement on the lower side, I should say, but there's some disagreement with the IA on the higher side. But we are able to capture the space that is already captured by the IA. Then there are transport demand, nuclear cost, renewable cost reduction, and also these things that fossil fuel, how much cost of extracting the fossil fuel will decrease, what kind of a saving will have, what kind of a improvement in the processes will have, then also the CCS cost reduction. So there are some positive side and there are some negative sides, and we will talk about that in the scenarios more. Then based on our discussion, we actually come up with the framework, which is very much interesting because there are 3 dimensions that we cover. One is AI growth. What is at what grade, let's say, at what pace that AI growth is happening in the society. Then what kind of is, whether they have a strong policy or a weak policy. And the third point, which we are actually covering in our SURE-AI Center, is AI governance. What kind of a safety nets, what kind of algorithms are they helping society, or whether they are actually harming society, whether they are actually aligned with the humans' values or not, what kind of I should say rules and other things is included in these algorithms. So that is very, very important, and I think so to help policymakers to make these governance strong, which will help the society in a positive manner rather than in a negative manner. I think so that's a good start, what we are doing in SURE-AI. So hopefully we will be able to make progress in our center in this area also. So when we are talking about AI growth, we are thinking about, okay, whether that's covering all economy, whether it's coming very few sectors. So those kind of a discussion was happening. So this is one area that we have to understand. and there's uncertainty also. And when we are trying to understand what will be the implication of this sector versus another sectors, that's also important, that what is the scale, or let's say scale or degree of AI adoption in different sectors and also in the region. So that's also very important. Comes the climate policy. They might have a positive impact if there is congestion with the AI growth. It might have a negative impact. It's actually weakening the climate policies. As I mentioned before, it might reduce the social acceptance. Then it's actually have a different negative impact. Then comes the AI governance. AI governance, if there's more and checks and balance, the scale might reduce. So that have a negative impact. It might impede the growth of AI because now you have to work on these algorithms to include this human alignment that require more before just, let's say, making humans as guinea pig and just you are releasing it. You have to include all these algorithms, human rules, and all those kind of a governance that might impede AI algorithm, but that might help climate policy because you are taking into account what is harming the society, what is not harming the society into your algorithms. So that might be a positive thing. So based on this, I should say space, we have a lot of uncertainty in this space. We have no idea. It's about what is your AI governance policy, how much AI is growing in which sector, what is your climate policy. You have seen it. Sometimes there's backlash. If some government is coming, you have seen already in case of US, in Biden, they have very big target. In Trump, they don't have the target. So what is your climate policy? That also all gonna shape what is the impact of AI in the future. So we created 4 scenarios. It's not working. Yeah. So we created 4 scenarios, which is also intuitive, and also it's based on the input that we receive from these experts. So first is AI race, where they're all thinking about, oh, we need to compete, we need to have a bigger cake, we don't think about climate, we don't think about other things, we just want a bigger cake, because this will solve every single thing. So this is the AI race scenario where AI growth is the prime drivers of innovation. And obviously, if there's a growth, there's a huge demand. So the high electricity growth that we actually observe in the expert, we actually assume in this scenario, in this narrative, when we are trying to parameterize these narratives to the parameters in the model. So in the AI growth, when there's a rapid growth, because this is AI race, every country wants to do that. Every country understands this importance. They don't want to lag behind it. So they are basically, there's a AI governance also heterogeneous. Some have a very strict policy, some have a different policy. We can see UK and US already relaxing it. You have already seen the Emergency Act in the US. So governance angle is different in different countries. EU have a very strong governance, US is not. So this is basically kind of today's kind of a scenario, that this is AI race scenario. And then AI flop, that it's a bubble. So you will not see these kind of a growth, and these enhanced capabilities and all that will be failed to materialize, and you will not be able to provide the societal benefit, which Microsoft was saying, if you're not able to see the impact, that will slow down. And if this AI growth will slow down, that will not have a huge demand on electricity, that will not have a huge impact on climate policies. But the other part is that AI growth can also be slowed down, that if you have a more governance. So they have a strict governance that will little bit slow down the growth of AI, because they now need to invest to safeguard to safety, disinformation, and other things that might reduce the growth of AI. So that's another scenario that we created. Second is climate misaligned. When we're talking about climate misaligned, there's a lot of advantage of AI, but that's going in a completely different direction, which will further increase the emission. So it's actually providing a lot of benefit in the fossil fuel industry and in the emission-intensive industry rather than in a green industry. So that might be a misalignment, and that might make fossil fuel more cheaper, then further delayed the transition away from fossil fuel to greener. That might also results. And also the other part is misalignment is that governance is completely absent, and that further harm the society. When it further harm the society, it weaken the position, it actually lead to more disinformation. Whether it leads to more disinformation, the climate policy will weaken. That will have a further negative impact on the environment. Then the last is, that's a positive one, to be sure, that is climate aligned one. So the climate aligned one is, yes, there is a growth, but this is in conjunction with the climate policies. So they are thinking about, this is again a scenario, they are thinking about congestion with the AI governance, the safety norms are there, the international collaborations are there, they're trying to reduce the negative societal impacts because of AI, and also helps to actually develop and improve the green technologies. And also, when they're actually giving, maybe in the new licenses to the data center, they think about and optimize where the renewables are, where the water is. So in the policy briefs, why I'm going to give you license for developing data center here, they will think about this. So the AI governance, AI growth, everything will work in conjunction, but we need to have those policies to be able to, let's say, materialize this scenario. So this is the scenario that we actually created. So let's see, what is the impact of this scenario on different emissions? And I want to highlight this is global emissions. So you can see when there's a climate misaligned scenario, all the advantages, advantage of AI is going to fossil fuel industry. They are able to lobby more, create more disinformation. They want to delay the process of transition towards green. You can see there's an 11.2% increase compared to a scenario where there's no AI, then there's an AI kind of a demand. So you can see the impact. It's a huge impact in the global emissions. That's 11.2 compared to AI race and AI flop scenario. The impact is there, but it's not that high compared to a climate misaligned scenario. And then if you try to understand the regional impact, it's again where you are seeing the regional impacts, where the demand is, US, China, India. So there the emissions are going to increase because there the data centers and the demand is coming, there all the investments are going on. So there's some sort of a alignment. But again, question is, they can change it if they actually have a policy in place. They don't have to go on this route. They can actually go in this route also if the policy is in place. So compared to this, so we try to understand if there's a huge demand, okay, you need to have the electricity capacity, whether we are ready. So these capacity addition needs to be added in the electricity plant. We have to think about this additional AI demand, which is coming from data center and others. Otherwise, again, as I mentioned, that will have a huge impact on electricity prices. The sectors which really needs electricity might have to face this problem. Maybe we will have the problem in the electricity sector itself. So we really need to think about what is the electricity capacity addition we need to add to meet this electricity demand. The interesting part is, yes, there's a lot of investment we are seeing to scale up AI. But this needs to match with the energy investment also. And who is going to, let's say, handle this burden, whether that will go to the public. They have to, the government have to use the public fund to meet this investment, or these AI companies and other companies who are basically profiting, they need to handle that burden. So this is a big societal question, how the policy should be designed, whether the burden should be handled by the public, or whether the burden should be handled by these companies who are basically creating huge burden on the society, because you can see, compared to a scenario where there's no AI, to a scenario where there's a huge AI, there's a huge investment you require in the energy sector to meet these needs of the energy. So this is a big thing. Now we also try to understand the individual impact. So if you look at this, it's a cost optimal scenario from the model. So you can see there's a 2.7. But if you don't change your source, if you are actually allowing fossil fuel to meet this additional demand that is coming from the AI, that itself, this factor, how you are basically satisfying these electricity needs, what is your source? You can see there is a 6% increase in emission, global emission, just because of this AI. We are not talking about all others, just because of AI compared to a baseline scenario where you are not thinking about AI. In this, where we are thinking about AI, there's a 6% increase. But as I mentioned, in IEA and others, we are only thinking about this electricity need from where that is coming. And we have already seen that some result from the first speakers, that what is the source of your electricity that's leading to emission. But there are a lot of indirect impact, and that might lead to more emissions. And we need to understand that more. First, we have already seen this. If the prices are actually reduced of fossil fuel, that will further increase the emissions because people don't want to shift it. If it's cheaper, oil is cheaper, why should I shift? Then there's a transport demand. If fuel is it's actually cheapest to actually travel per mile, people might travel more. If it travel more, they have a more emissions, depending upon how the system is going. But I would skip this part, but I would like to highlight this part. Depending upon, there's a lot of talk, like in Norway, the power is coming from hydro. But there's also a lot of talk in UK where they're saying, oh, we will, let's say, get the power from nuclear. There's a risk attached to that nuclear also, whether those municipalities are able to handle the nuclear waste, whether they have aware. So then again, the position of data centers also become important. If you are adding a captive power plant for these new data center in a place which is not close to power plant, then what will happen? Then you need to have a captive power plant, and then you can make a decision whether you want to invest in renewables, whether you want to invest in fossil fuel because there's a power dependency, or whether you want to invest in nuclear. Then again, more kind of a bureaucracy things. So that's why whether they want to go in this direction, whether they want to take the responsibility if something's happened in the nuclear case. So there's a lot of policies involved in these kind of decision makings. And sometimes they want to lobby it to make their life easy. Sometimes they don't want to lobby it. But I think so. This is a very good thing if they are going for optimal location, and if they can handle the captive power plant, they should invest in renewables to meet their demand rather and handle the additional burden that is coming from these AI centers and other centers. Good part is, look at the demand. So the hyperscale facility have a very flat load. So it is very difficult, very easy to manage from an electricity planning point. If you have a flat load, you can optimize it very easily compared to if it's a variable, you have to handle it in a different manner. But if it's a flat load, it's actually easy to manage and optimize it to make sure that your environmental impact is less. And the second point is, I think so Baltasar already highlighted this point. There's an improvement in efficiency, and what is the efficiency of your facilities also. So there's a term called power usage efficiency in these data centers. And if you have a different power usage efficiency, we have not considered, we have done it outside of this model, but you can see the requirement, your power requirement is going to reduce compared to if you have a low efficiency to high efficiency. So hopefully, they also think about these things when they are developing future data centers to improve the efficiency so that actually environment impact is also reduced in the future. Key takeaway, not to take more time, is we are talking about electricity demand, but we need to understand this indirect impact also, that to understand how this will actually propagate in different sectors. It's very difficult to understand the correlation, but we need to understand it to understand whether it's going in positive direction or negative direction. Second is, there's a high growth of electricity, but we need to have a good policy in place so we are not locked in the fossil fuel infrastructure again for next 10 years, and we move away from this fossil fuel infrastructure. We need more exploration. As I mentioned, there's a lot of information relationship. We need to understand how AI demand is actually affecting a lot of different sectors, already started affecting, but we need more empirical studies to understand this relationship so that we can model it, how that relationship is going to change in the future. That also we need to handle it. The next step that we are planning to do in the few coming studies and also as part of SURE-AI is economic impact of AI, whether that's increasing inequality, whether that is decreasing inequality, because if the inequality is increasing, that might have an impact on energy demand. So, and whether you can justify, oh, the green benefits or the economic benefits of AI is outweighing all the cost. So we need to understand these claims also. So we need to understand the economic impacts of AI also. And the second point is water footprint. That is also a very big thing, but we need to track, have a good data. Right now, after we finish this study, there's a good study from, I think, so UC Berkeley or some, they have actually provided very good data and estimates from US. So we will try to incorporate that in our model, because previously that data was not available. So we were not able to do that in this paper, but hopefully in the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shivika. I am immediately calling for questions. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, have you calculated any likelihood for the different scenarios? Did you calculate any likelihood for the different AI scenarios? And if yes, what scenario has the highest likelihood? And the third part of the question, what would need to happen to shift the most likelihood scenario to environmentally positive scenario?
This is a very uncertain space, to be honest. That's why we started with expert elicitation rather than, I should say, quantitative assessment. But I'm going to say that we have not looked at this because we actually have a better understanding with, if you look at this one, at least we understand from experts what is the distribution of these values. Now question is, what policy will be in place? That's a policy decision. There's a lot of things. So it's to calculate likelihood is very difficult. We wanted to do that, to go back to stakeholders, showcase our scenario, and ask them what they think, what will the likelihood, high likelihood, and low likelihood, rank some scenarios. But then we dropped that idea because, again, it was difficult for them to even come up with these kind of numbers with their calculations and others. This is still very uncertain space to actually, we need to, I should say, observe more. We require more empirical studies to actually have a better estimates rather than actually giving these kind of estimates to public and say, oh, this is high likelihood and less likelihood, because things can change how the policy works and how the companies will make the decision.
Yes.
So there has been a bit of geopolitical stuff happening recently, specifically on the fossil fuels, right? So I was wondering, do you think that can have a significant, I guess, positive impact on the emissions now that we see countries like India, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines going in for more solar power to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels?
Because we are actually monitoring this crisis, so we have already seen the positive, I should say, impact. We've already seen the positive impact, I should say, in case of a Russian crisis, at least in Europe, where in Germany, a lot of adoption of heat pumps, solar in Spain. But the countries who have not moved, they are now also understanding, oh, we have not moved, but the countries who have moved, they are actually able to manage this crisis in a better manner. But they're also trying to understand that if just changing the source, like from Russia to America in the terms of LNG, we are still stuck in that vulnerability. So that's a positive sign. And in terms of this geopolitics things, we've already seen decrease in LPG in India. and others, and also in Pakistan, they are able to manage this crisis compared to, if you remember, the Sri Lankan fertilizer crisis, where that, let's say, completely destroyed their GDP. So they are able to manage this crisis again because of solar. So these countries, because of their experience, which is very difficult to, pitch to people why they have to switch, but these crises are helping. So let's say induction cooker, which is very difficult to pitch to Indian, let's say, audience because of cultural issues and all. Because of this crisis, there's a sudden shift in the cooking area, which I never imagined, to be honest, in the scenarios, but there's a shift in such a small space. So these kind of a crisis also helps, but I don't want these crises to shift. But yes, there's a positive windfall also of these crises. So again, but if this cheap, there will be a lobbying, there will be something in the real world. There are a lot of levers that actually keeps on doing it, but I think so policymakers are understanding that dependence on fossil fuel is gonna expose them to more vulnerability in the system from the AI side, from the climate side and others. So that's a positive sign, I should say.
Thank you. Yes?
Thank you. It is interesting question. Just I wonder, maybe I understand differently. Previous slide, you said or you showed the amount of electricity AI using 30 and the difference is 40 years is decreasing. I wonder the reason why.
Sorry?
The amount of electricity using of AI decreasing in 20. You across to some graphic, previous.
Which one?
First, electricity demand, yeah.
This one?
Yeah.
Oh, this is distribution of the result that we got from experts. So what is the probability distribution? So based on the expert, it's not the result, it's a results distribution where the experts were lying.
Yes.
I want to ask if in the possibly indirect or maybe direct impact of the increasing use of AI is also the use of resource. Resource, I intend, for instance, if we move outside from the cities, the data center, we need to create the infrastructure to use DC data centers outside the cities. But not to create this infrastructure, we need more resource, cables and more mining. And also if we switch from fossil fuel to renewable, also for the renewable we need more resource, more rare materials, more mining again,
yes.
More water again, more electricity. Is because you presented some indirect impact. I think
that's a direct impact
yes.
for our definition, because we can directly at least see the causation. Because if you require this much demand, what is the resource required? What is the water required to produce X, Y, Z? So we can easily map those out. So these are direct impact. But as you are mentioning, so that is a very good question. And this is a question now policymakers already started asking. So because previously, this was not a big issue. So they were not thinking about that it's going to be affecting the public infrastructure. When you have a public infrastructure, then public funds will be used. And then from where that public funds will come, that will come from taxes and other kind of things. But profit is going to this AI company. The question is, who will handle this burden if this much resource is required in these data centers, and that will burden public infrastructures? Then taxes will go to actually meet the data center demand or electricity demand. Then you have to cut down on something on health, education or something. So this is a basically, I should say, trade-off in the society when you have a limited public spending, where you want to spend. So California is basically saying, okay, we will expedite your approval to create data centers, but you need to bear the burden of grid upgradation. You need to bear the burden of this additional demand and all. So you need to handle this burden. Then you will get approval. If you're not ready to do that, then you are not allowed in our, let's say, city or state, sorry. So those kind of a policy is required to handle that the public infrastructures, public spending is not stressed by this additional demand. So I would prefer this kind of a policy is coming in different other states and different other countries, but this is a very good start, I should say. But hopefully other cities or state government also take inspired by this and create a positive policies to make sure this transition is happening in the right direction for the society, not in the wrong direction.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we thank Shivika.
Thanks a lot.
And we move forward after a smaller reorganization to the panel discussion where we have our speakers again on stage. So if both of you are approaching, then you can sit in the, maybe you can take, yes, yes. Qui? Dell'acqua. So in the meanwhile that there is a little bit of reorganization, let me introduce you to the other panelists that are taking space and place. And first of all, here we have Fulvio Castellacci, professor at the TIC Center at the University of Oslo. We have 2 PhDs from University of Oslo and from University of Rome La Sapienza. And he has also been director of the very TIC Center for quite a long time. His research is in the economics of innovation. And this is becoming central in this topic, in this approach. So, in fact, he's also coordinating a research council research project on the economic effects of AI. So, probably replying to some of the questions that were laid out in the last slide before. Our next panelist, it's not least than Baltasar Beforel Lozano, so Balta for short. And he has a PhD in electrical engineers. He is a professor and chief researcher at the scientist at Simula Metropolitan. And he is head there of the Department of Signal and Information Processing and Intelligence Systems. Now, Balta is a very successful research leader. EU projects, research council projects, and not least than 2 centers of excellence in Switzerland and Spain. For us, in SURE-AI, he is the center director of SURE-AI. So here he is. But don't think he's only directing research. He is actually an active and prolific researcher himself. About 200 papers or something there. And his topic is definitely on signal processing, data science, and machine learning. So we are right at the spot of what we need to know about how costly is this AI. So welcome, everybody. Here we are. So let's get started immediately. Maybe Fulvio, you have been in this economics and technologies and all this introduction of new AI technologies. But we heard a lot about the costs, but also the potential of gaps, inequalities. So what can you give us as an example of inequality and what impact it may have?
Okay, I think these presentations have shown how interesting these topics are and how complex and uncertain. So your question adds one more layer of uncertainty and complexity because of all indirect effects that Shivika has so well described in their framework. we can add uncertain impacts in terms of inequalities. When we think about inequalities related to AI or possible inequalities, we do not know what will happen. We can think of three types, three different examples. So one of them is the, let's say, distinction or inequality between capital owners, those that own financial capital, those that manage and own companies, businesses, and so on, versus employees, that is, those that are employed in this company, employed workers. So capital labor is a traditional distinction that is studied in economic terms. What we can expect that we already see a large and strong patterns of market concentration. One possible expectation that we may see in the next years, this market concentration will strengthen, particularly in sectors related to AI production or actively using AI. And therefore, this may exacerbate difference between capital owners and employed work. So capital labor ratio may increase in favor of capital owners. This is one example, but although it is highly uncertain. A second type of uncertainty that has been very much studied, that is a major reason of concern for us, is wage inequalities. That is, inequalities that may arise from the fact that some workers are high skills, they work in the service sectors, in consultancy, high-tech knowledge works, and so on, while others work in factories. They have lower skills, routine work, and so on. So what we have seen in the last 2-3 decades has been there has been an increase in wage inequalities, this much before AI. This was due to the impact of other capital-intensive technologies, which were using much more skilled workers compared to unskilled routine work. So what we saw in the last 2-3 decades was increase in wage inequalities between the skills and the less skills. Now, what is interesting about the current wave, although it is too early to say, but what we see is that with generative AI, very early evidence that we see now on labor market impacts, is that it seems that generative AI in general, is reversing this type of effects. So in the sense that it might be very well that high-skilled workers, knowledge workers, workers at university, in service sectors, those that write, think, do analytical work, can very well be very highly exposed to the risks of automation. Although it is too early to say what will happen, but we can see that perhaps this is a reason to say we might observe a reverse of this type of wage inequalities, where routine work, manual work will become more relatively scarce and more important in the next years compared to what has been the case in the last decades. We do not know whether this is true, so this is an open question. Nobody knows. It's something that we fear. And finally, there is a third type of inequality that refers more to the global level, so not within each country, but more across countries. What will happen at the global level? Well, we know already, it's easy to expect that there are the leading AI countries, US, China, those that are already actively investing and leading this type of technologies, will probably use this advantage to increase their competitiveness in the world, increase GDP per capita, sovereignty and power in economic and political terms in the international economy. It's less easy to see what will happen to other countries. AI is relatively easy to use. So it is difficult to produce and develop, but it's relatively easy to use. So we may also expect that perhaps less developed economies, those that lack skilled work infrastructures, maybe can have the possibility to have a leapfrogging, catching up due to the use of AI, something that it was not possible to do before in previous decades. But this is a brand new type of technology, a new way to organize the economy, which perhaps may turn out to decrease the distribution of income in the future. Again, let me emphasize that these are examples of 3 different types of inequality, but the patterns in the future is highly uncertain.
Do you agree?
So I've done some work also on labor market outcomes I know the literature. I agree that we don't know for sure. I agree that there is a lot of uncertainty. I agree that AI has the potential to be different compared to previous technological revolutions. Having said that, using an approach similar to the one that I presented today, looking, however, at labor market outcomes, and again, keep in mind that, once again, this is about the past 20 years, so the future might be different. But what we find there is that we find evidence that, at least in that period, AI seems to promote automation, and as such, it lowers the demand for labor for many workers. And we do find differential effects. And in particular, the effects, if you look at the effects across the wage distribution, it's negative throughout the wage distribution, except the top 10%. So the results that we have, which again are based on the past, the future might be different, is that still, at least until recently, these technologies seems to complement the top workers, the workers with that are already earning more than the rest. And in terms also in terms of skills, they also increase the demand for specific STEM workers compared to the rest. It's true that there are new studies, recent studies, that suggest that generative AI might be different. And in some cases, and again, these are narrow studies, so whether the results will generalize at a broad level or not is an open question. But those studies seem to suggest that generative AI may help the middle low-skilled workers precisely because it eases basically the pressure on cognitive capacity, which might be more relevant for the less skilled workers. So yes, there is hope, but at the same time, it seems that at a large scale, we have not seen a lot of evidence in that direction yet.
And Balta, as a skilled worker in this direction, do you feel threatened by AI, or you are on top of it?
From a scientific point of view, I think it's quite natural to think that simple tasks that require less reasoning will be more and more automated, right? You see people using this cloud code, people writing books every week. It's certain things that are less, let's say, require less deep reasoning, probably will be more and more automated. But then when it comes to really breakthrough research and really deep things that require a lot of reasoning, we need to keep in mind that LMMs and the current systems really they don't do deep reasoning. They do prediction. They try to just suggest predictions, right? But of course, people are working on world models right now that will try to build reasoning systems that are more, but that will take some time. So it's a matter of how we see. If we see it short term, medium term, or long term. Long term, the LLMs will be surpassed by world models, which are much more capable to reason. And that will take some time. And then manually, what Fulvio was saying, the manual manipulation of things also will take a bit longer, but at some point there will be things which will be automated by robots also. Maybe not everything, but some of the parts. What worries me also in terms of skills is what is happening now is this de-skilling, where people are relying too much on systems, and then people are losing skills in some domains, and that's a problem, right? Because it's like same as if you, in mathematics or in any discipline, you're trying to solve a new problem. If somebody gives you a guideline, right, or a sketch, or some cue of how to solve it, then you go and continue and solve it. But your brain is not it's not getting ready for taking a new leap, and a completely different problem and think from scratch, right? You're losing a little bit of ability. So this is happening now. And there are studies also showing this. So this is another risk somehow that is coming. How we build the trade-off between helping to solve problems, but also not making people, lose skills, right? So that's it.
But all these inequalities now that we have taken from the labor point of view, how do they fit together with these sustainability goals?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there's 2 points which I would, this is like, again, maybe Balthasar can help us to like explain it in better manner. But the point is, if you are talking about, as we were discussing in the SURE-AI, you require some checks and balance also. And you require for that checks and balance from a human side at every single steps. Oh, if AI is hallucinating, there's a checks, human will check. If you are losing and you are start losing those expertise, then how you will figure it out whether the information, whether the things you are getting from AI is correct or not. That will further create problems in the society. So that skills is also important to understand whether what you are getting out of AI is actually correct or not, or it's a hallucination. So those experts, if right now we have experts in the society which are not trained on AI, so they have the skills. But the future in the college, if people are not developing that skills, that you will lose the skill, and then who will do it? Maybe that's a scarce thing. But the second thing is, we have already seen that we have compared to, so Amazon, how much labor is employed in the Amazon warehouses that sends, let's say, shipment. But now China has actually developed a new warehouse in France, which is called Jobai, and everything is like very few labor compared to an Amazon warehouse. So everything is automated. There's hardly any labor involved. So these kind of a thing we are already seeing at a very large scale. So the point is, if this needs to be addressed, what kind of a policy, whether the policy will come, okay, out of all the profit, you will get some sort of a payment in your bank account every month, and that will reduce the social unrest, because if there's a large scale unemployment, there will be social unrest. So policymakers still really need to understand this kind of a impact on the society, and how to make sure the I should say, dissatisfaction in the society and all that will reduce, and there's a peaceful society kind of a things on the rules. So those kind of a policy also needs to come as the AI is developing, automation is developing. What kind of a policy is required to make sure that there's less inequalities, and the, let's say, fruit of this innovation is shared by others also.
I would like to follow up on this, because it's an important aspect that also makes explicit the relation between possible inequalities and the impacts in terms of, let's say, climate change and related policies that are needed, that you asked about. So the fact is precisely this: the studies, research, policy debate within the green transition emphasizes how important it is individuals' perception of policies that are implemented in order to address this. So people want a just transition. And when transitions is not perceived as fair, just because, for example, it has distributional implications that have negative impact for vulnerable groups, or maybe when there is a lack of recognition or procedural justice, so different aspects of justice, this may negative backfire, and that is hamper and weaken political support for environmental policy. So this is exactly where inequalities enter, where if AI will have inequalities impacts in the society, and particularly if it will be coupled with strong impacts in terms of structural unemployment, like Shivika was mentioning as a possible scenario among many. So this will create a fertile ground for populism, lack of political support for the green transition. So my opinion is that AI by itself and these possible inequalities will not have a direct effect on environmental sustainability and policies, but they may amplify this by having indirect effects on the political support or lack of political support for the policies that are needed.
So this one a little bit brings us to the concept of polarization that was mentioned before. But what about disinformation, right? Because social media, AI generated, the fact that people see what they like to see most of the time, instead of going and being provoked by other points of view, obviously is expected to create a kind of widen effect on polarization. How do you account for this? How do you measure, if it's possible, this kind of side effect? Any taker?
So there's something happening now in research in cybersecurity, which is called cognitive security, which is about how you introduce fake information to modify the opinions of the people, right? And in AI, this is happening all the time. So you have people trying to modify opinions and injecting information all the time. So this is not this is one of the cases where this is going to happen. You have people trying to push for this direction, will inject information. And right now, the amount of fake information and false information is everywhere. So even at a scientific level right now, probably all of you know this archive, right? Archive where people upload papers, right? Or information, right? So there is kind of the system is getting broken because people are uploading all kinds of papers there. So you may find, so I've seen this paper where you see two papers which are basically, I mean, it's a paper with this title and this, the text, and then there's another paper that has been generated with other authors, in this case where it's Chinese, and some title, and the paper has a different structure, but it's the same, right? So then you have to be very careful right now how to trust information. Even open platforms are not checking what is this, what is that. So there's a lot of false copies, I think in this area. I don't know how much is happening in this area of AI and climate change, but I can imagine that it's all full of information that might be wrong completely.
So do you think this is kind of putting at stake the whole climate policy perception?
Yes.
The value of climate?
Yes, so I think CISRO is also involved. So there's a new report that is out from US, which is basically questioning the whole together the existence of climate change by using some fake papers, some, I should say, 4 or 5, I should say, papers which are basically creating disinformation. And then, again, then your skills are required. There are a lot of, I think, so 86 scientists basically question every single claim that is made in that report that is published by government. So now the question is how the society has very less that kind of skills to understand it, how the public is going to trust. That is information that is coming from the government, and you expect the government is basically giving you a right information, you have the trust, but then they're actually using this kind of a method to actually create mistrust and not, let's say, create more, that's like you can call it positive feedback loop of popularization and lack of support for the climate change policies. So these kind of things we have already seen happening. And again, it's actually create more work for the experts to create, provide information. So that's why I'm saying it's not always, AI is not always going to create efficiency in the system, because it will also add this noise, this disinformation. Then you require more work to actually provide justification, whether that video is fake or not, can that be used by a lawyer in the evidence or not, whether that can be used in a scientific study, whether that can be used in the policy document. So that's actually creating more work. I'm not sure whether you can call it against, or it's creating more work. So this is also an interesting thing that we are going to see in the future.
Would you envisage AI working against AI to provide true information and not only fake one then?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes.
Yes, but let's see a little bit. Now, when we come to all these questions, how do we talk about, on the other side, Now, we've talked about hardware, we have talked about data centers, we've talked about energy that is physical, warehouses where we need it, etc. But what about algorithms, Balta? Where do we can get any kind of improvement at the very core of AI so that maybe we can gain something? What is costly?
Yeah, so the first
there?
thing, the first thing to understand is how you measure this, right? So people, typically computer scientists talk about flops and floating operation points, which are not really the right measurement for energy. So to look into the energy footprint, you need to look at essentially, I would say, three things. So you have either you do computation locally or in a cloud, but mostly many things are run on the cloud. Then data centers, as I said before, they spend, let's say, 50% or something like that on computation, 35% on water cooling, and 15% is lightning and power distribution losses and service, security systems, control security. Then the computation is not so much on the these classical current systems are based on a building block that is called transformer, where they have these large matrix multiplications. But the problem actually is not in the matrix multiplication. The problem is in the memory, because it's like, to understand for the audience, maybe the best thing to think is like a chef in a kitchen, right? You have somebody in the kitchen cutting onions, right? But it has to go 1 mile down the road to pick up the onion, bring the onion, chop. So the energy to actually compute is much less than all the back and forth, because you have billions of parameters. So you have billions of parameters, like billions of onions, carrots. You just go there, pick it, come here, cut, mix, go back again. So billions of parameters. So the data movement, which is called the memory wall, is the big one. And then the computation is also important, but is the data movement is like 100 times or more the energy than the computation of the multiplication. But the multiplications have been very much optimized with the GPUs and all that. You can do still multiplier-free processors and so on. You can do some tricks, but it's not the big problem is that. So that's computation. Then they have the water cooling. The water cooling is also very important, but that's not algorithmic, right? That's something that other people. So from the computation point of view, the things to do this is to attack this problem, right, of computation and data movement. So you can do different tricks. You can take these billions of parameters and then quantize them, meaning that instead of using 32 bits, you use less bits. So you just use less resolution. You can also prune, which means some of these neural networks basically are nodes connected with a lot of connections, with weights. So you can take some of them and remove them. Pruning, right? Then you can do other things like some of these big networks are like a composition of many sub-networks. Then you can do what DeepSeek did, which is a kind of a mixture of experts would say. It's like you have multiple sub-networks, and then you only activate a few ones, because the problem is that for output, when you output one token of this, one output, if you don't do anything, you are activating billions of parameters for a single output. That might be very small. And in traditional systems, you activate all the billions of parameters for every output of a single token, right? And so this mixture of expertise, like choosing some of those sub-networks and deactivating all the others, right? Then the other thing also to consider is the training versus inference, right? One thing is to build an airplane, another thing is to fly with the airplane, right? So training is a kind of episodic thing, right? You do training with a massive amount of data, sometimes, a number of times a year, and that consumes a lot of course, it consumes a lot of energy. We're talking about, they don't publish the last numbers for the last models, but GPT-4, JAMA, all these things, we are talking about 50, 40, 60 gigawatt hour, right? 60 gigawatt hour, 50 gigawatt hour means, a nuclear plant is a bit less than 1 gigawatt, but you cannot spend one nuclear plant just for you. So, but basically you need to have for weeks or even months, sometimes a nuclear plant running for you, right? But then that is episodic. That takes part, and then the big jump comes in the inference, because the inference is you have hundreds of millions of people doing queries every day. That means, billions of queries per day. And that takes, when you go, that we're talking about now terawatts hour, right? So the big junk is not in the training. Some people think about training, but training is, episodic, right? It's maybe a few times a year. That's not the big junk. The big junk is the inference, having hundreds of millions of people doing queries every day, which is globally maybe billions of queries per day, right? So a lot of the research also comes in both. The research comes in the training, of course, and in the inference. So there are different approaches, but more or less these are the ones. And then in the center, of course, we are looking at clever things, like optimization methods that are able to, iterate less number of, you need less number of cycles to computation, and we need core rigorous optimization that allows us to finish faster, or to even sometimes get bounds on what you can achieve, so that you know that you are close to the optimum, then you stop before, right? You need to go all the way. When you know what's going on, as it happens in many systems nowadays, you just keep iterating and you hope that, well, you will get somewhere that is more or less okay, and then you have a rule of thumb, say, okay, I stop here. But the idea is, of course, to understand convergence guarantees, to have bounds, what you can achieve, so that you know where you are somehow, right? That's part of what we will do in the center, to try to provide these guarantees. And in all these things, of course, you always exploit algebraic structures and symmetries, some kind of structure, right? To be clever into how to use it. And then from the hardware point of view, you can, of course, optimize still a few things. You can reduce number of multiplications. You can be better in the data movements. But also you can do another thing which we will plan to do, is kind of alternative architectures. Like, for instance, not using transformers. Right? So you can use brain-inspired computation, which uses spiking neural networks, because the brain uses much less energy than the GPUs. So that requires other types of training, other types of operation, or going into other types of, as I said before, these world models that uses algebraic topology, or other types of more sophisticated mathematical tools, Kuhlmann algebra. There are different things there that allows you to do, to reason and to predict, to do more than just what the elements do, which is suggesting and predicting something, right? These are not systems that allow you to reason deeply, to understand consequences, right? That's where we are going. And that will, when you know the consequences are better and you understand how to reason and abstract, then you will be able to compute less. Because now it's kind of more or less, in my opinion, these transformers is more brute force. It's just scaling up, without guarantees of what's going on. So that's a problem, right? In SURE-AI, we want to try to either optimize current systems, but also propose completely different architectures, right? More efficient.
So you have mentioned several areas of mathematics, in fact. Yeah. And for the people here who are from mathematics, of course, they probably all of them have been called in, because that's a highly interdisciplinary request, the one you are putting down, together with the activity, together with people from computer science that are working on this. Do you see this feasible?
What, to combine both?
Yes, to provide the result.
To combine basically deep mathematical tools with I think that's what some of us do. I mean, I have combined education as a physicist and as an electrical engineer, so I try to do both. I think it's necessary, right? We need to do that, right? Otherwise, you need to do all these advances in core foundations to be able to change the AI paradigm. There's no other way. I mean, how can you, without mathematics, provide guarantees? There's no, I don't see how to do it. Right.
Let's see a moment about this.
And your area of risk is also very important. We haven't talked about that, but that's also very important. I mean, to control this these systems have been optimized, many of them on average. Many of them, they call it empirical average, but many of them are not able to really control very well the bad outcomes, bad things happening, so that's still there.
So talking exactly about these things you are mentioning last, now, how, here we have discussed this misalignment, right? Misalignment at global level, at human level, ethical level, there are many different values, but sticking to the issues of sustainability and misalignment. So we have all taken the idea that our climate and our globe, it's what we care for. Nevertheless, it seems that there is some disinformation that can put this value not in the top position any longer. But in general, how can we align AI to achieve this kind of goals? Also from the inner part in this respect. So what would be the next step? And from the algorithmic, that is one side, but from the policy point of view, now here we have all these questioned policies you have put up. What would be the priorities? How would you rank first things to be done?
I think we need better regulations. It's, of course, a very complicated issue, and it touches, it has many ramifications. I think all the things that were mentioned today are relevant. So we need more research, because to me, initial problem is that even among us, which are experts in different fields, we worry because of the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty. So first, we need to better understand, we need to do more research. Second, the outcome of this research should reach the people, should reach the policymakers, and here this connects to the issue of the disinformation and so on. There used to be a sort of say that truth has an advantage being true, so eventually you learn it. But nowadays, I'm not so sure that it applies any longer, because trying to identify in the context of these complex issues the truth is very difficult. There are many limitations, and at the same time, it's so easy to produce this information. And so in terms of regulations, maybe regulations about certification of information. This is something that I've heard in the past, perhaps not so much now, and it worries me. We have these technologies for certification, even blockchain, so things that are not far from AI in the sense of algorithms and so on, that can be used to certify information. I think we need regulations that go in that direction. And then in more practical terms, for sure, we need to align the incentives of AI, and it means the providers of AI, so the companies that are building these models, with the perspective of the society. And at the moment, it seems that the business model that they are following is not very well aligned, not just because of the pictures that we discussed today, but also here, we were mentioning that computing power, just to ask ChatGPT for the weather, and you don't internalize that. It's the business model, I don't think it's really optimized that you pay a subscription of 25 euros per month, and then you can make any number of queries you want. And on top, after each query, you get this, why don't you ask another question, which seems related to maximizing engagement. So it seems that they have an objective which is very different from what a social planner would have in mind. Yeah. So I think regulation should step in and try to realign all these things.
So on the last point, we were discussing this, but again, as Baltasar mentioned, we really require, because right now, okay, whether you require this information from ChatGPT, how's your weather going to be or something, you have apps, you can use it, or now people are moving away from Google to ChatGPT, even for search, whether you require it or not, to create memes and all. So there has to be a label that actually make the user more conscious. What is the environmental cost of my each query? What is the footprint of that query? If you are actually able to label it, but as he mentioned, the objective is to keep people more engaged, so they will subscribe it, they will subscribe for the higher version and number of queries kind of a thing, what training model or data will be used for this. So they are basically modeling on that kind of a, let's say, business model, not that a user will get this information, oh, this is your footprint, do you want to add one more query to check what is your weather, or you can check the Google or your app. So that's, we have done that for, let's say, cigarettes. We have done all for the, let's say, societal bad products. Why we are not doing it for this? People should know what is the impact of their actions. And then I might write less query compared to, it's like how you put these things in their mind. So
but
that
maybe
is
it's just the novelty of the product, and then people like to test it out, right? Then when it will be old, nobody uses that any longer. Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah. Fulvio, policy.
Yeah, just to say, follow up, I do agree on the importance of regulation. I just want to add one thing as a complementary observation that I think although AI has some specific peculiar characteristics, so people say this time is different, but still in large part it builds up upon other waves of information communication technologies that have been developing already for 3 decades. I remember at the beginning of the 2000s, when I was doing my PhD, there was the initial wave of ICTs. So people were talking about same topics that we were discussing now, but using ICTs. So is this time different? When are we going to see productivity effects? Is there going to be the end of employment? Things very similar to the issues that we're discussing now. So there is a lot of accumulated empirical evidence and also a lot of policy evidence around the world that we can learn from. It's not going to be exactly the same now with AI. But the fact that regulation has been very weak when it comes to, for example, regulating, protecting vulnerable groups from ICTs, such as the teenagers, for example. This is something that we can learn. We don't need a big technology forecasting experiment. We can just say that we know that this is going to be the case. So there are some vulnerable groups and situations, risks that are concrete and may just reflect and continue the same things that we have seen happening in the last 2-3 decades. So policy should learn from the recent past.
But I should say policy should be in the pace, like the pace that AI is moving, policy needs to be in that pace. And sometimes we understand policy makers not able to understand the, let's say, new technology, and they lag behind. And then we see already seeing the impact. So I give you example, in the past when we are, let's say, there was one case where they basically say, okay, no social media actually increase the addiction. But those kind of a thing is not in the technical term, so they actually won the legal case. But that's my point. So those needs to be keep an update, legal policies, I should say regulatory policies that needs to understand what is coming in the future, and they need to make sure that there's a checks and balance in the society, so the less harm is done, and actually these companies are more socially, or let's say, responsible. So those kind of a thing needs to be actually in place before it gets out of the hand kind of a situation.
Balta, one last comment.
No, I mean, I'm just thinking all the time in terms of how people measure these things. So there are tools actually to measure the actual, I mean, there's something called, for instance, Code Carbon that was developed by the Mila Lab, where you can measure exactly, it measures the amount of energy that you consume in the algorithm, you know, like GPUs, CPUs, memory, etc. Then it also multiplies by this power, PUE, the power usefulness
Usage
efficiency, you know, which is like this ratio between the total amount of energy and the one used for computation, because you have water, cooling, and other things. And then it also looks at the location where you are, and then checks if you are taking energy from a coal, you know, supplier or from a renewable. So in principle, there are ways to estimate something. They could do these estimations and do some kind of carbon footprint, right? Because it's not the same to run, I guess, something in Norway, right? What you use maybe more hydro energy or something like that than running it in a place where you always use coal energy, right? So, but there are ways that they could measure these things. I don't know how much they provide in terms of data.
So that's my point, that if the regulation are there, it's easy, it can be done. It's not a very, if I can do it, they can also do it with such a huge investment with that skills, they can do it. If they actually have a regulation on these companies not to increase their emissions, they will invest in this. They will make sure that they actually, which side they will optimize at their level to reduce their emissions at a company level, because that's why I'm saying regulation is very, very important at this phase, so we don't lose this sight.
Yeah, because the question that everyone asks is globally, is like you said before, I mean, globally are the increment in efficiency, call it as you want, productivity, is going to compensate of the emissions that are generated by the running the AI algorithms, right? That's the key, right? So you can attack this in different ways. You can say, okay, I increase more the productivity, but I guess my understanding is that you need to increase, to make these systems less energy, to make them more efficient, to have less consumption. Yeah.
So we have a lot of things to do, plenty of research to go for, need for more data, regulations, and definitely go down to more renewable resources, providing stable energy. Nothing less than that. What a program. Who's going to take it? Thank you, everybody, for the nice chat. Thank you. If anybody wants to keep talking with the panelists, now we can have just a free time. Thank you.